In the early morning hours of May 16, 2005, dispatchers in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho received a call that would unravel into one of the most violent crimes the region had ever witnessed. But this call did not come from a neighbor reporting screams in the night. It did not come from a witness describing suspicious activity on a quiet residential street. It came from someone who had noticed something far more unsettling, a family that had suddenly gone silent. When officers arrived at the small residence on Frontier Avenue, nothing visible from the street hinted at what awaited them inside. The neighborhood was modest, familiar, and residential. Single-family homes stood close together along tree-lined streets. There were no broken windows. No signs of forced entry. No disturbance that would have immediately drawn attention from anyone passing by. The house looked like any other on the block. Ordinary. Quiet. Unremarkable. But inside, investigators discovered a scene of calculated brutality that would immediately elevate this from a local emergency to a national crisis. 4 members of the Groene family were dead. The victims included Brenda Groene, the mother. Mark Mackenzie, her boyfriend. And 2 of her children, 13-year-old Slade Groene and 9-year-old Dylan Groene. The nature of their injuries made it clear within minutes that this was not an accident. This was not a domestic dispute that had escalated out of control. The level of violence indicated a deliberate, sustained, and methodical attack. As officers moved carefully through the residence, documenting each room and securing the scene, a crucial and terrifying detail emerged. 2 children who were known to live in the house were missing. 8-year-old Shasta Groene and her 9-year-old brother Dylan had been inside at the time of the attack, according to preliminary timelines. But Dylan's body had been found among the dead. Shasta, however, was gone. There was no indication she had fled on her own. No personal belongings suggested a voluntary departure. Her absence immediately transformed the scope of the investigation. What law enforcement was now facing was not only a quadruple homicide, but a suspected child abduction. And the clock had already started ticking. If you're drawn to cases like this, cases that unravel slowly and reveal the darkest capabilities of human behavior, then hit that like button and subscribe to Cold Case Beacon. Now, let's continue. From the outset, detectives noted that nothing of value appeared to have been stolen from the Groene home. Valuables remained in place. Electronics were untouched. This ruled out a random burglary gone wrong and pointed instead towards something far more disturbing, a targeted act. But the reason for that targeting was, at this stage, completely unclear. The crime scene suggested that the attacker had entered the home late at night and had remained there long enough to move through multiple rooms, to commit multiple murders, and to remove a child from the premises. This was not a hurried act. It was not impulsive. It was controlled, methodical, and carried out with a level of violence that suggested prior experience. Within hours, the Coeur d'Alene Police Department contacted state and federal authorities. The case expanded rapidly. The disappearance of 8-year-old Shasta Groene following a quadruple homicide triggered statewide alerts and drew immediate national attention. An Amber Alert was issued. Search efforts began almost immediately. Roadblocks were established in and around Coeur d'Alene. Nearby wooded areas were searched. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, asking if anyone had seen unfamiliar vehicles or individuals in the area during the night or early morning hours of May 16. No one reported hearing screams. No one reported signs of a struggle. This absence of witnesses would become one of the defining challenges of the case. Investigators were forced to consider the possibility that the perpetrator was someone completely unfamiliar to the victims. Someone who could enter and leave without drawing attention. At the same time, they could not rule out the possibility that the attacker had prior knowledge of the family or the layout of the house. The lack of forced entry suggested either unlocked doors or someone who knew how to gain access without breaking anything. Early media coverage described the scene in limited terms, following law enforcement requests to withhold specific details that might compromise the investigation. What was publicly confirmed was enough to establish the gravity of the crime. 4 dead. One child missing. And no clear suspect. As hours turned into days, the focus intensified on locating Shasta Groene. Her photograph was distributed across multiple states. The message was simple and urgent: an 8-year-old girl had been taken, and time mattered. Behind the scenes, investigators began constructing a detailed timeline of the night of the murders. They examined phone records, vehicle movements, and any available surveillance footage from nearby streets or businesses. Nothing immediately stood out. The lack of a clear motive complicated the early stages of the investigation. Detectives found no known enemies, no recent conflicts, no ongoing legal disputes involving the family. The Groenes had not been involved in activities that typically place individuals at higher risk of targeted violence. This raised an unsettling possibility, that the crime was random. That the victims had been selected not because of who they were, but simply because of where they were. As the case developed, attention turned to known violent offenders in the region, particularly individuals with histories of crimes against children. Databases were reviewed. Parolees were questioned. Tips poured in from the public, though most led nowhere. Each passing day increased the statistical likelihood that Shasta Groene would not be found alive. Investigators were acutely aware of this reality, but they continued to pursue every lead with the same level of urgency. Forensic analysis continued at the crime scene. Evidence collected suggested that the attacker had left behind traces that could eventually identify him. But forensic processing takes time. DNA results would not be immediate. Fingerprint comparisons required matching against known databases. At this stage, there was no guarantee that any of those efforts would produce a result in time to help Shasta. What made the case particularly disturbing to investigators was the combination of elements involved. A mass homicide. A child abduction. No witnesses. No clear motive. No immediate suspect. It was the kind of case that could remain unsolved for years. And yet, despite the severity of the crime and the resources being poured into the investigation, what would ultimately bring it to an end would not be an advanced forensic breakthrough or a coordinated federal operation. It would be something far more ordinary. But at this point in the story, no one knew that yet. For the residents of Coeur d'Alene, the murders shattered a fundamental sense of security. This was not a city accustomed to crimes of this magnitude. Parents kept children home from school. Community meetings were held. Doors that had routinely been left unlocked were now bolted. Law enforcement faced growing pressure to produce answers, to provide reassurance, to restore some semblance of safety. For investigators, the priority remained unchanged: find Shasta Groene, identify the person responsible, and prevent further harm. As the search expanded beyond Idaho's borders, the case entered a critical phase. The investigation was no longer just about understanding what had happened inside one house on Frontier Avenue. It was about tracking a suspect who could be anywhere, traveling with a child whose life was at immediate risk. At the same time, detectives continued to piece together the lives of the victims, looking for any connection, any overlooked detail that might explain why this family had been targeted. The Groene family was not considered prominent in the Coeur d'Alene community. They were not wealthy. They were not isolated either. They lived a relatively ordinary life in a region known more for its natural beauty than for violent crime. Brenda Groene was raising her children following the end of a previous relationship. At the time of the murders, she was living with her boyfriend, Mark Mackenzie. Together they formed a blended household that included multiple children of different ages. Investigators interviewed neighbors on both sides of Frontier Avenue. Most described the family in neutral terms. They kept to themselves. There were occasional noises typical of a household with children, but nothing that had prompted concern or complaints. School records showed that the children attended local schools. Teachers and administrators reported no warning signs that might indicate danger from within or outside the home. No custody battles. No restraining orders. No stalking incidents. From an investigative standpoint, this absence of red flags was significant. In many homicide cases involving families, detectives uncover a history of domestic conflict, financial stress, or escalating threats. In this case, none of those factors were immediately apparent. The Groene family did not fit established risk profiles commonly associated with targeted violent attacks. This led investigators to consider two main possibilities: either there was information missing from the public record, or the family had been selected for reasons entirely unrelated to their personal circumstances. As detectives continued building victim profiles, they examined the physical layout of the home. The house was easily accessible from the street. It did not have a security system. Doors and windows were standard for a residence of its size and age. There were no barriers that would have made entry particularly difficult. This did not mean the family had been careless. It meant they lived in a community where extreme precautions were not considered necessary. The location itself did not stand out as especially vulnerable. Frontier Avenue was not isolated. It was not adjacent to highways or industrial zones. Yet it was close enough to main roads that someone passing through the area could access it without difficulty. This detail would later take on greater significance. As part of the background investigation, detectives also looked into whether the family had any indirect connections to individuals with criminal histories. This included former partners, acquaintances, and extended family members. These checks did not produce any viable suspects. The lack of a personal connection between the victims and the perpetrator increasingly appeared to be a defining feature of the case. For Shasta Groene, the missing child at the center of the investigation, this realization carried serious implications. If the abduction was not driven by a personal dispute or a custody issue, it suggested that the person who took her was motivated by something else entirely. Recent events in the family's life revealed nothing unusual. No clear reason. This uncertainty complicated the search. Without a motive, there was no clear direction. As the case developed, law enforcement began to widen its scope beyond Coeur d'Alene. They considered the possibility that the perpetrator was not local. That he may have been traveling. That he may have identified the house simply because it was there. This theory aligned with one of the most troubling categories of violent crime: opportunistic attacks carried out by offenders who move from place to place, leaving little connection to their victims. Such offenders are difficult to detect because they do not appear in the social orbit of the people they target. They are not neighbors. They are not co-workers. They are strangers. At this stage, investigators could not confirm that this was the case. But they could not rule it out either. What they did know was that whoever entered the Groene home had done so with confidence. He had moved through the house without hesitation. He had committed 4 murders. He had selected a child and removed her from the scene. That level of control suggested prior experience. As public attention grew, law enforcement remained cautious in its statements. Details about the family were released sparingly, out of respect for the victims and to protect the integrity of the investigation. But behind closed doors, detectives continued to search for any overlooked connection. The conclusion they reached was unsettling in its simplicity. There was nothing about the Groene family that explained why this had happened. They were not chosen because of who they were. They were chosen because they were available. This realization forced investigators to confront the possibility that the threat was not confined to one family or one neighborhood. It raised questions about how the perpetrator had arrived in Coeur d'Alene, how long he had been there, and where he might go next. To answer those questions, detectives needed to look beyond the victims and begin focusing on the type of individual capable of committing such a crime. That shift would lead them toward a man whose history, even before 2005, showed a pattern of extreme violence and predatory behavior. A man who, at the time of the murders, was already moving through the region undetected. That man had a history that spanned decades. A pattern of violence that crossed state lines. A name that would soon become synonymous with one of Idaho's most disturbing crimes. Joseph Edward Duncan III. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. As investigators expanded the scope of the case, attention turned toward individuals whose history suggested the capacity for extreme violence. This included offenders with prior convictions for crimes against children, particularly those known to be mobile, transient, or recently released from custody. One name would soon rise to the surface. Joseph Edward Duncan III was not a resident of Coeur d'Alene. He had no documented ties to the Groene family. He did not appear in their social circle, their employment history, or their neighborhood records. At first glance, there was nothing to connect him directly to the crime scene on Frontier Avenue. But when detectives examined his background, a very different picture emerged. To understand who Joseph Duncan was in May of 2005, investigators had to look back decades. Duncan had a long and disturbing criminal history that predated these events by several years. His record included multiple convictions related to sexual offenses against children, as well as acts of violence that demonstrated a willingness to use force, intimidation, and control. He was known to law enforcement agencies in several states. His criminal behavior had begun early and escalated over time. Previous offenses had resulted in periods of incarceration, but each release was followed by continued movement across state lines. Duncan did not establish long-term residences. He traveled frequently, often staying in temporary locations or living out of his vehicle. This pattern made him extraordinarily difficult to monitor. Despite his record, Duncan was not under active surveillance in 2005. Like many offenders released after serving their sentences, he was subject to certain registration requirements. But those measures relied heavily on self-reporting and local enforcement. There was no centralized system capable of tracking his movements in real time. By the spring of 2005, Duncan was effectively off the radar. Investigators would later determine that Duncan had been traveling through the Pacific Northwest in the weeks leading up to the Groene murders. His movements were not random. He selected locations that allowed him to blend in easily. Places where his presence would not draw attention. Coeur d'Alene fit that profile. Duncan's prior crimes revealed a consistent pattern of predatory behavior. He targeted children. He used manipulation, deception, and violence. He demonstrated planning, patience, and a complete lack of remorse. These were not impulsive acts. They were calculated. Psychological evaluations conducted during earlier incarcerations had identified him as a high-risk offender. These assessments warned of a strong likelihood of re-offending, particularly if he remained unsupervised. Despite this, there were limited legal mechanisms available at the time to restrict his freedom of movement beyond the conditions of parole. For investigators reviewing his file, the concern was not whether Duncan was capable of committing the crime. It was whether he could be placed in the right location at the right time. At this stage of the investigation, Duncan was not yet a named suspect in the Groene case. His name existed among many others in databases being reviewed by task forces across the region. What distinguished him was the combination of his history and his mobility. He was someone who could enter a community, act, and leave without leaving obvious traces. Law enforcement agencies began comparing the known details of the Groene crime with Duncan's past offenses. The level of violence. The selection of child victims. The absence of a personal connection. All of it was consistent with his established behavior. Another factor raised concern. Duncan had previously expressed fantasies involving control and domination over children. While such information alone does not constitute evidence, it added disturbing context when viewed alongside the facts of the case. Still, investigators lacked a direct link. Despite processing DNA evidence and running fingerprint comparisons through multiple databases, the forensic approach yielded no matches. There were no eyewitnesses placing Duncan near the Groene residence on the night of the murders. There was no vehicle description that matched one known to be associated with him. In most cases, this gap would have delayed progress significantly. But events were already unfolding elsewhere that no one could have predicted. Unbeknownst to investigators at the time, Duncan was traveling with Shasta Groene. He was moving through the region, driving on public roads, passing through jurisdictions where officers were unaware of his identity or his connection to the crime in Idaho. This was not unusual for him. Duncan had spent years avoiding detection by staying on the move. What made this situation different was the presence of Shasta. Her survival at this stage depended not on the speed of forensic analysis or the accumulation of intelligence. It depended on chance encounters with law enforcement that could occur anywhere, at any time. As the manhunt continued, Duncan remained unidentified. His name was buried among thousands of files being reviewed by overwhelmed investigators racing against time. The case had reached a critical point. If Duncan could avoid detection long enough, the investigation risked becoming another unresolved tragedy. The lack of a suspect meant the search area remained vast. Every highway, every rest stop, every rural campground represented a possible location. What investigators did not yet know was that the break in the case would come not from a task force briefing or a laboratory result. It would come from a routine observation in a public place that had nothing to do with roadblocks or forensic science. A moment of recognition that would change everything. By the time investigators were reviewing offender databases and mapping interstate travel patterns, Joseph Edward Duncan III had already left Coeur d'Alene. He was traveling by car, moving through rural and semi-rural areas, staying briefly in locations where he would attract little attention. With him was 8-year-old Shasta Groene. The exact sequence of events inside the Groene home on the night of May 16 was not immediately known to law enforcement. What could be established, based on later evidence and court records, was that Shasta had been removed from the scene and transported out of the area within a short time frame. There was no indication that the abduction had been interrupted or observed. The lack of witnesses suggested that the offender had acted during hours when activity in the neighborhood was minimal. Once on the road, Duncan followed a pattern consistent with his previous behavior. He avoided major urban centers and favored locations that offered isolation and limited oversight. This included remote campsites, forested areas, and transient accommodations. For investigators, these details would only become clear after the fact. During the weeks that followed the murders, search efforts focused heavily on Idaho and neighboring states. Law enforcement agencies coordinated across jurisdictions, sharing information and reviewing tips from the public. Despite these efforts, there were no confirmed sightings of Shasta. The absence of reliable leads was not due to inaction. It was the result of a moving offender operating in environments where detection was difficult. As time passed, concern for Shasta intensified. Statistically, prolonged abduction significantly reduced the chances of recovery. Investigators were aware of this reality, but they continued to pursue every available avenue. Court documents would later establish that Duncan maintained control over Shasta as he traveled. He provided for basic needs in order to keep her alive while avoiding attention. This aspect of the case underscored the calculated nature of his actions. At some point during the period of captivity, 9-year-old Dylan Groene was killed. The precise circumstances and timing were determined through subsequent investigation and legal proceedings. Law enforcement has been careful in how this information is presented publicly, given the age of the victim and the nature of the crime. What is known is that Dylan did not survive the abduction. For Shasta, survival depended on a series of factors beyond her control. Her continued presence with the offender, rather than being left behind or separated earlier, would ultimately make her visible to law enforcement in an unexpected way. Throughout this period, Duncan continued to move across state lines. He was not actively fleeing a known manhunt, because at that time he had not been identified as a suspect. He was simply traveling as he had done many times before. This distinction is important. Duncan was not evading police roadblocks or surveillance operations. He was not changing behavior in response to being sought. He was moving freely in public spaces, using highways and local roads, blending in with ordinary traffic. This meant that the opportunity for interception existed, but it relied on coincidence rather than targeted pursuit. Behind the scenes, investigators worked to narrow the field of potential suspects. Forensic evidence from the crime scene was being processed, but results were not immediate. Even when DNA is recovered, matching it to an individual requires that person's profile to already exist in a database and be accessible across jurisdictions. At the time, those systems were far more limited than they are today. The case had entered a critical window. Each day that passed without a breakthrough reduced the likelihood of a safe recovery. Public attention remained high, but tips continued to lack verification. For law enforcement, the challenge was compounded by uncertainty. Without knowing where Duncan was, or even that he was the offender, resources had to be spread thin across a wide geographic area. Then, on July 2, 2005, more than 6 weeks after the murders in Coeur d'Alene, something happened that no one had anticipated. A customer at a Denny's restaurant in Coeur d'Alene noticed a man sitting in a booth with a young girl. The girl appeared uncomfortable. The customer thought she looked familiar. After a moment, the realization struck. The child resembled the missing girl whose photograph had been circulated for weeks. The customer alerted restaurant staff. Staff members observed the table and agreed. The resemblance was too strong to ignore. One of the employees called 911. Within minutes, law enforcement officers arrived at the restaurant. They approached the booth carefully, not wanting to provoke a confrontation in a public space. The man seated with the child was calm. He did not attempt to flee. He did not resist. Officers asked the child her name. She identified herself as Shasta Groene. The confirmation sent shockwaves through the responding officers. The man seated across from her was Joseph Edward Duncan III. Duncan was taken into custody at the scene without incident. Shasta was immediately removed from his presence, placed under protective care, and transported to a secure location where medical professionals could evaluate her condition. For investigators working the Groene case, the notification came as a shock. The suspect had not been identified through forensic analysis. The breakthrough had not resulted from a coordinated manhunt or a targeted search. It had resulted from a customer recognizing a child's face and a restaurant employee making a phone call. Within hours of Duncan's arrest, law enforcement officials publicly confirmed that Shasta Groene had been found alive and that a suspect was in custody. The announcement brought relief to the community, but it was tempered by the knowledge that the case was not yet fully resolved. Investigators still needed to determine the fate of Dylan Groene and to establish the full scope of Duncan's actions during the weeks following the murders. As the case moved into its next phase, attention shifted from locating the missing child to building a prosecutable case against the man now in custody. The chance encounter had ended the search. What followed would determine accountability. With Joseph Edward Duncan III in custody, the focus of the investigation shifted rapidly. What had begun as an urgent search for a missing child became a comprehensive effort to document the full scope of the crimes and prepare the case for prosecution. Law enforcement agencies from multiple states coordinated to reconstruct Duncan's movements in the weeks following the murders. Using witness statements, physical evidence, and location data, investigators traced his route across state lines, identifying locations where he had stopped and areas where he had remained for extended periods. This process led to the discovery of Dylan Groone's remains in a remote area of western Montana. The finding confirmed what investigators had feared since Duncan's arrest. Dylan had not survived the abduction. The recovery allowed authorities to formally account for all victims connected to the case. It also strengthened the evidentiary foundation against Duncan, establishing a clear timeline and linking his actions directly to the outcomes for both children. Shasta Groene, meanwhile, remained under protective care and removed from public view to begin the long process of recovery. Given her age and the nature of the case, law enforcement and medical professionals limited public disclosure about her condition and statements. Her role in the legal process was handled with extreme caution, balancing the need for evidence with considerations for her long-term well-being. Duncan was charged with multiple counts, including murder, kidnapping, and other serious felonies related to his actions in Idaho and beyond. Prosecutors moved forward with a case that relied on a combination of forensic evidence, physical items recovered from Duncan's vehicle, and corroborated timelines. The scale of the charges reflected not only the severity of the crimes, but also the broader implications of Duncan's criminal history. During pre-trial proceedings, Duncan's prior convictions were examined in the context of sentencing rather than guilt. The court focused on establishing responsibility for the specific acts connected to the Groene family. This distinction was critical to ensuring the integrity of the legal process. The trial proceedings confirmed what investigators had already concluded. Duncan acted alone. There was no evidence of accomplices. There was no indication that the crimes were part of a larger network or coordinated activity. The court found Duncan guilty. He was sentenced to multiple life terms in prison without the possibility of parole, as well as additional sentences that included the federal death penalty for crimes committed across state lines. The sentence ensured that he would never be released back into the public. Joseph Edward Duncan III died in prison in March of 2021 while awaiting execution. For the legal system, the outcome closed the case. For the community of Coeur d'Alene, it marked the end of a period of uncertainty and fear. For Shasta Groene, it represented a transition into a different phase of life, one shaped by events that had occurred far beyond her control. The Groene case also prompted renewed scrutiny of how high-risk offenders are monitored after release. Questions were raised about interstate tracking, information sharing between jurisdictions, and the limitations of existing registration systems at the time. While no single policy change can be directly attributed to this case alone, it became part of a broader national conversation about offender supervision and public safety. From an investigative standpoint, the case is often cited for a different reason. Despite the extreme violence involved and the resources deployed, the resolution did not come from advanced technology or long-term surveillance. It came from public awareness. A customer at a restaurant. A phone call. A response. This aspect of the case has been studied in law enforcement training as an example of how community vigilance and basic procedural discipline can produce extraordinary results. It also serves as a reminder of the unpredictability of criminal investigations. Even the most carefully planned crimes can unravel due to factors beyond the offender's control. For investigators who worked the case, the outcome underscored the importance of persistence, coordination, and the willingness to pursue every lead, no matter how small. For the public, it highlighted the reality that serious offenders can move undetected through everyday spaces, and that intervention can occur in the most unanticipated ways. Today, the Groene case remains one of the most significant criminal investigations in Idaho's recent history. Not because of how long it lasted, but because of how it ended. A case that began with a violent crime in a quiet neighborhood concluded in a Denny's restaurant, where a stranger's awareness brought a 6-week nightmare to an end. And with that moment, the search was over. Thank you for staying with us through this investigation. Cases like the Groene family tragedy remind us that behind every headline are real people, real consequences, and moments of courage that can change everything. If this story moved you, if it made you think, or if it reminded you why awareness matters, then please subscribe to Cold Case Beacon, drop a comment below sharing your thoughts or telling us what case you'd like us to cover next, and hit that like button so more people can find these stories. We'll see you in the next investigation. Stay vigilant.